5,
4,
3,
2,
1.
go.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm Ed Kellum-Turner.
And I'm David Southworth. This summer at the National Space Centre, we're focusing on space across the world, looking at space in other cultures, in other countries. So today on the podcast, we're going to be looking at some of our top collaborations in space exploration and investigation. But first, Space Wows. Ed, what have you got for us this week?
Well, I've got a pretty exciting space wow this week. It doesn't actually come from the solar system. It comes from outside the solar system.
Okay.
It is an interstellar object, an interstellar comet. It's called 3I-Atlas.
Catchy name.
Very catchy. Obviously, that's going to catch on. But Atlas is the actual telescope that spotted it.
Okay.
And 3I is because it's only the third ever interstellar object actually discovered.
What were the first two then?
So we've talked a little bit about the first one, actually how to pronounce this thing.
Oh, right, okay.
Which is, I'm going to have a go at it. You
Good
ready?
luck.
It's Oumuamua. That was discovered in 2017. And the much easier one was 2I Borisov. That was in 2019.
Borisov, named after a discoverer?
I think it was named after the person who discovered
Okay.
it. Yeah. But this thing is an interstellar comet coming in. So obviously we get comets here on inside the solar system, these icy worlds. I mean, we
Yeah.
talk a lot about them in our kind of day-to-day delivery here at the National Space Centre, but we don't usually talk about interstellar ones.
They tend to come from the Kuiper Belt or the Oort cloud.
Yeah,
the
you
edges
usually
of the
get
solar
one.
system.
So you probably have heard of like Halley's Comet. That
Yeah.
comes from probably around the Kuiper Belt, has a period of kind of 70 years or so. And then from this Oort cloud, this theoretical region, millions and millions of miles away from the sun, and that's going to take, about a million years to actually get around. But this thing is just whizzing its way through the solar system. And it was discovered very, very recently, or announced very, very recently, and it's currently on its way towards the sun. It's not going to hit it. It's going to get a few. It's far too small to cause any damage to the sun, of course. But it is going to come within about 200 million kilometres of the sun. So still
Okay.
a bit further away than the Earth is from the sun. But,
So won't
pretty
quite
close.
qualify as a near-Earth object. It's not a threat to the Earth.
So I think it might actually come within the range of a
Okay.
near-Earth object, but it isn't going to be
Okay.
any problem.
Nothing to worry about.
And I tell you what, it definitely won't become a problem because this thing is moving so fast that kind of the gravity of the Earth and really the gravity of the sun actually is going to barely affect its trajectory.
Interesting,
It's
okay.
travelling at 58 kilometres every single second. So I did a little
Right.
Google. This is the same thing as travelling from London to New York in just a minute and a half. So anyone who was lucky enough to go on Concorde where it took them hours, and
Yeah.
that was the fastest, no, this is a minute and a half. And what's crazy as well is we think this thing could be as old as 7 billion years old.
Oh, so way older than the solar system.
Almost twice the age of the solar system. And I was thinking about this, I was going, this is especially exciting because when we talk about comets in our solar system, we've actually been to comets, we've landed on comets, in fact, and we've discovered the actual building blocks of life, these organic molecules
Yes.
that all life needs. And this is a comet that's come from outside of the solar system. Does that have the building blocks for life?
Right, so maybe those building blocks for life were already in the disk of material that made up the solar system, and perhaps that's how they got to the comet, so maybe this is very different. Interesting.
Yes. But more importantly, if this is the thing that's come from outside of our solar system and come in and does have those building blocks for life, it could have come from another
Of course.
star system.
Yeah, you're right, that would be even more interesting.
Exactly.
Much more. Yeah.
So, I mean, I say if we sent a mission there.
Too
I
fast.
highly, highly doubt we're going to be sending a mission to this object because it's simply, as you say, travelling too fast, and two, we've only just discovered it. We're a bit too late to actually send a mission there.
Do we know if it's going to just zoom straight through the solar system and leave again? Or do we think it might enter an orbit of the sun? Any
It is travelling
clues on that?
way too fast
So it's
to enter
probably gonna
into
go
an orbit.
straight- just
It
gonna go
is
straight
just
through.
going to go straight on through.
Okay.
We just talked about the fact that this thing's travelling too fast. We can't send a mission out there. There is actually a mission that we do have a theory of. It's actually a joint mission between the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency to actually send a spacecraft out into the solar system and wait for an object like this to be discovered
Interesting.
hope that we're close enough so that we can then go and kind of visit it and analyse it.
That feels like wishful thinking, doesn't it? But a lovely idea.
It's quite wishful thinking, but I mean, there's some very clever people out there. So if anyone can complete it, I'm sure it is hopefully the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency.
Well, I think that definitely qualifies as a space wow.
Definitely
Some fascinating facts. Mine, I'm afraid, is a little bit less of a wow factor. In fact, it's not really a space wow. It's very much just becoming my regular feature on my show.
A bit of a space update from
Which is
David.
an update on Donald Trump and plans for the Artemis program. Now, the Artemis program, as regular listeners and viewers will be aware, is the plan that NASA have to take people back to the moon over 50 years after the... In fact, the anniversary of Apollo 11 landing is coming up in the next couple of days, 56 years.
56, I think it's
July
on Sunday,
69.
I think we were looking at.
I think it's Sunday.
Yeah.
And Josh and I did an episode, I think episode 2 of this podcast, where we talked about the proposed cuts to NASA's budget.
Yes, and since then I think it's changed about 4 times.
Yeah, it's unclear. It's really unclear a lot of this. We've done a couple of updates as well. The impact of that was that the Artemis program would be certainly reduced. We were expecting after Artemis 3, the next planned moon landing of people on the moon, that the Space Launch System, the rocket, would be dropped, that maybe a private partner would be brought in, possibly SpaceX. And so the future of the Artemis missions, the Lunar Gateway, all things like that were very unclear. Well, we have news. So Donald Trump has recently had approved by the Senate his tax and spending package. I'm going to be reading some of the details here. I should just make that clear. This, incidentally, if you were listening to when I gave an update about Elon Musk and Donald Trump falling out, it was over this bill largely. He's not a fan. So lots of extra tax. There's a separate political argument about the equity, the fairness of who this tax falls on. But that's for another podcast. But the interesting thing is, it looks like $10 billion has been set aside for Artemis-related projects.
Fantastic. Because, I mean, Artemis itself is very, very expensive. Just one of the SLS rockets costs, I think, $4 billion.
I think that's right. Something in that
so,
ballpark,
I mean,
anyway.
it needs this injection of funds, really, doesn't
And
it?
to be fair, that number would get cheaper the more of them you use.
Oh, absolutely.
If you just do one, it's hugely expensive.
Because that's the thing, when we're coming to rockets, a lot of the cost, well, not just rockets, a lot of everything, the cost is the setup. So creating the facilities, once we've got those facilities,
you
it
can
reduces the
repeat
cost.
it. Anyway, so that $10 billion looks like it's split like this. So the phrasing is, I'm definitely reading this, $4.1 billion for the procurement, transportation, integration, operation, and other necessary expenses of the Space Launch System for Artemis 4 and 5.
Very official.
But these are the things that we thought were being dropped. So that very strongly implies that the Space Launch System, that rocket, will be used again for Artemis 4 and 5, which we're expecting to be the second and third moon landings of this new program. That's an unexpected change from the previous situation. Also some money for the Orion spacecraft, again quoting, for use with the Space Launch System on the Artemis 4 mission and reuse in subsequent Artemis missions. Again, that seems to bring that back on the table.
Yep.
And there's also $2.6 billion set aside for the Lunar Gateway. Now that, tying in with what we're going to be talking about today, is a collaboration with Canada, with Japan, with the UAE, with ESA. But that, again, that's the space station that's planned to orbit the moon. And again, we thought that was being dropped.
Yeah, and that was especially disappointing because actually some of those modules had been already made and built, basically.
Absolutely.
And as Josh
and I talked about in a previous episode, that was a very forward-looking part of this program. So the update is, it appears there are $10 billion set aside for these programs. It looks like the SLS, the Space Launch System, will continue beyond Artemis 3. So who knows? It's kind of all up on the table. As ever with this administration, we need to take this maybe with a pinch of salt. It contradicts directly the proposed budget that the Trump administration put forward. So it looks like a positive move. Hopefully that will see the Artemis program extended back towards, if not completely, what we hoped it would be originally. But I think, again, as I've said before on this podcast, watch this space. I'm sure we'll have more updates to come.
Yes, we'll bring you back in every single time there's an update, which might be every week.
I fear it could be, yeah.
So today on Space Now, we're going to take a look at some of our top picks for the coolest examples of collaborations in space from across the world. Now, David, I think you've got a pretty good one, especially for this time of year, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm starting with, I think, the biggest and best. Maybe not the biggest, but it's very, very important. This is, the official name is the Apollo-Soyuz mission back in 1975. Sometimes kind of informally known as the handshake across the world, I think, or there was a handshake in space.
Well,
I
if
think
it's
is the phrase.
Apollo-Soyuz, I'm guessing USSR and the USA,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah. And so this was a collaboration in 1975. Now, of course, the context of that is we're in the Cold War. That's been going for a good 30 years. The space race with those two nations competing to be the first to do things in space. And suddenly we find that they're working together. And I think this is a culmination of, well, it followed on from the Apollo moon landings, which are often viewed as kind of the end of the space race.
Which the last one was in 1972, so
72.
3 years before this.
That's right, yeah. But apparently, I found out just researching this, the instigation for this was much, much earlier. So Kennedy, the American president, and Nikita Khrushchev, the General Secretary of the USSR, had been talking back in the early 60s about potential collaboration. So really early in the space race.
Yeah.
And apparently, not confirmed, I think, but there was even a suggestion they might do a joint moon landing at one stage. Kennedy, of course, was killed. Khrushchev died, and that kind of was then lower key. It didn't get taken forward, but it did come back in the 70s. So yeah, this was this mission where, as part of the Apollo program, the Soviet Soyuz mission, they docked in low Earth orbit. So these two missions launched around the same time and docked together in low Earth orbit. Hugely significant if you, again, consider the context of that Cold War and these two nations fighting each other, not literally on the battlefield, but certainly metaphorically, ideologically, and up to that point in space.
Well, I suppose even more than that, you've got two spacecraft docking together. They're not meant to dock together, right?
I mean, that is a really interesting part of it, which I was going to come to later, but I will jump to it because I think it's the most interesting technological thing about it, certainly. They have different docking systems. And there'd been some work on a combined one that could work. What they ended up doing was they had a module, a sort of separate module that went in the middle. It basically acted as a dock for both sides. More than that, it was an airlock because they had different pressurization systems.
Okay.
So the Soviets pressurized the Soyuz capsules to atmospheric pressure with a mix of nitrogen and oxygen. The American capsules were done to roughly a third of atmospheric pressure and basically pure oxygen, so much more similar to a modern aircraft.
So completely. So if they had just sort of docked together, well, actually, they wouldn't have even been able to open the doors, would they?
There would have been a pressure issue, certainly. And so they designed this module that acted as an airlock, that acted as a pressurization stabilizer. That's probably not the right word. We'll go with airlock. I'll stick with airlock. And a docking module. So they used that to dock. A couple of other things that I found really interesting was it was, first of all, we should say it was a success. It was a PR coup. It worked really well for both countries. But going into it, both countries were very skeptical about the other one's technology. So, for example, the Russians designed their spacecraft to be fairly automatic. They could basically be flown from the ground. The Americans, quite the opposite. They designed them to be flown by the astronauts.
So they actually, I know the astronauts actually have input, or had
very
input,
much so,
I should
and
say,
required to
in
have that input.
How to actually, what buttons were needed.
And that was needed. They couldn't fly it without that input.
Yeah.
So it was a much more technologically complex operation to fly those American spacecraft. And the Americans were very skeptical because the Russians didn't build in much margin for error. They didn't have a lot of redundancy. So if something significant broke, that was kind of it. They just had to come back to Earth. So there was a lot of skepticism. There was a lot of skepticism about how the collaboration would work, as well as the technological things. But it went really well. And what I think is a really nice takeaway from this, obviously it led to a lot more collaboration in the future, the sort we're going to talk about. But the two commanders of the missions, Thomas Stafford on the American side, who'd been the commander of Apollo 10, or certainly been on the Apollo 10 mission to the moon. Alexei Leonov on the Soviet side, who did the very first spacewalk. They hit it off so well that they were the ones that did the handshake, the famous handshake, when they met. But they had a friendship through the rest of their lives, and they were godfathers to each other's children, which I think is incredible. I think, again, in the context of the Cold War, that's really a very positive outcome on a very personal level, as well as just for space exploration. So I think that's a really good one to start us off for a collaboration. I feel like that kicked everything off.
Whilst they weren't necessarily achieving anything, like say, but the whole point of it is building a foundation of what was achieved after that. Absolutely.
Although they did actually do experiments together as well. So
perfect.
They did work together. They even did, just very briefly before we move on to your first one, in the last episode I recorded with Josh, I talked about the Proba 3 mission creating fake solar eclipses to satellites. They did that. They undocked the Apollo spacecraft, got in position to block out the sun so the Soviets could take photos of the corona. So they really did work together in a very impressive way.
Absolutely excellent. Now, I think that a really good jumping point from one of your top collaborations is one of my top collaborations. I think it's quite an obvious one. It is literally in the name. It is the International Space Station. Yeah. So, yes, collaboration between NASA and Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, but also we've got the Canadian Space Agency, ESA as a whole, of course, which the UK is part of, and we've also got the Japanese Space Agency as well. But I actually want to talk a little bit about kind of the origins. So, a little bit before rather than just everything else that happened. So originally there was no kind of collaboration. Both Russia and America had come up with these ideas for space stations.
They had their own separate space stations in orbit at various times.
Yeah, America had Skylab and Russia had just about finished up with Mir, the Mir space station. And one thing that they were kind of coming up with is Mir 2. That was kind of the second... Well, I shouldn't say the second Russian space agency. They'd already done 7 Salutes and then 1 Mir. They're coming up with the next Mir space station. And then America came up with Space Station Freedom, which I think is an awful name, and I'm glad it didn't happen. Very American, but I'm glad it didn't happen in the end. But rather than kind of making these individual space stations, they decided, well, we can collaborate. So actually, the International Space Station, which was first module was launched in 1998. That first module was actually the first module of Mir 2.
So that was planned to be part of a new Soviet space station, and it was repurposed for an international one.
It was built to be part of it. It was basically done when they were like, well, we'll actually kind of repurpose it and send it up. And the exact same kind of stuff that you were talking about with kind of the docking of these two separate things came up as well. So in the design of the International Space Station, which was basically designed as it looks like now, it took a very long time to kind of build it. It took about 40 missions or so, well, probably even more than that now. But they had to actually plan in the fact what kind of air mixtures are they going to be using. Of course,
because they're coming from those two perspectives. I talked about different approaches. Very interesting.
But they can't have a different approach with an airlock between kind of the two segments.
And
it's got to be one.
Do have their own slightly separated areas, don't they? They have the Russian modules and I think it's called the American modules, even though
a lot of the kind of habitable parts and a lot of the inhabitable parts, they are kind of half of it is American, half of it is Russian. You do also get some additional funding from Canada, from ESA. Well, ESA has got a module up there, the Columbus module, and then JAXA actually sent up kind of this part of a laboratory, so for experiments and things like that. But it is essentially almost half Russian and half American when it comes to the habitable space.
And so from what you're talking about, they had to come to it, unlike the one I just mentioned where they had a link module and airlock, they had to agree a compromise or one of the systems.
Exactly, and it's you can really tell the difference when you look at it from the outside. So if you've ever seen kind of a close-up image, because even they've got different ways of basically wrapping and protecting their modules from solar radiation, from thermal radiation, things like that.
So the outer protection looks different.
Exactly. The inside also looks a little bit different because obviously the Russian side, all the buttons and switches are in Russian, whereas the American side are all in American. So lots of these compromises. There's a great compromise that I love is that the orbit of the International Space Station isn't perfect for either country, because it's basically got to be sort of halfway between each one so that both countries can actually launch to it.
Which is what you need for a compromise of any sort, but between international superpowers who have very different needs and wants, it's quite encouraging, I find, that they can come to that sort of compromise.
Yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, that kind of collaboration with the ISS is actually ending now, and I don't think there's much more collaboration that's going to be happening between Russia and the USA, although there is now some collaboration that's possibly happening to do with space stations between China and Russia, which is quite interesting, as well as US and sending US astronauts and ESA astronauts up to private space stations, so launched by private companies as well, which I think is really, really interesting.
So a very brief run through.
We could be here for a full podcast, so I thought I'll keep it brief and just talk about the actual collaborative stuff and the compromises. But
very interesting. So, in terms of going forward, it's watch this space for what happens in terms of collaborative space stations in the future.
Exactly, and hopefully we'll actually see a private space station be launched. I don't think it's this year, but the earliest estimates are 2026, so next year.
Oh, that's way sooner than I realised. Yeah.
Well, that should have been launched a long time ago. As it always comes to space, it should have been launched ages ago, and it hasn't yet, because everyone went, don't worry, it will only be 5 years. And then it's 10 years by the time they actually launch it. So definitely watch this space over the next few years.
Well, I'm going to take us away from human spaceflight.
Good idea.
And we're going to look at a space probe, Bepi Colombo. Now, this, for those of you that don't know, this is a spacecraft that's on its way to Mercury. It's going to have a look at the planet Mercury. Now, although Mercury is relatively one of our closest planets, it's relatively quite hard to get into orbit around Mercury. I think the gravity of the sun has a huge impact, and it's quite hard to slow
You've got to like
down
slow yourself down and then also speed yourself back up after
tricky.
that. So,
trickier than you'd expect. So it's actually only the third mission to really do this. Mariner 10 back in 1974.
NASA,
right? That's right. Did a flyby of Mercury, and then Messenger in the 2010s orbited Mercury for a while.
Also NASA as well, so just America at the moment.
This one is not NASA.
Good.
This one, as you trailed, we're going further afield.
Yes.
This is a collaboration between ESA, the European Space Agency, and JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency. So what this is essentially two satellites traveling together as a single spacecraft. And they're going to both be orbiting Mercury, going to be looking at slightly different things, but they've agreed on this launch system, and all of the project up to arriving in Mercury is completely combined and working together. There's a couple of, there was one fact, you may have already known this, because I think you know more about Bepi Colombo than I do,
possibly so,
which is strange that I'm talking about it, but there we go. The name. Do you know where the name comes from? I didn't know this.
So I believe it's something to do, it's in part of how Bepi Colombo is getting there, right?
No, it's not. Well, it's linked to that. This is the interesting fact I was going to say. It's named after an Italian scientist, I think astronomer, called Giuseppe Colombo. Bepi apparently short for Giuseppe. So it's his name, it's his nickname, Bepi Colombo. He was the first person to propose a gravity assist manoeuvre. So in that sense, it absolutely does link to
that's how Bepi Colombo is not using as much fuel as it would otherwise take.
Precisely. Right? So it does what feels like a convoluted route, one flyby of the Earth, 2 flybys of Venus, 6 flybys of Mercury, all of which are now complete. All of which, the gravity assist maneuver is sometimes talked about as a slingshot. It's where you go around a planet, usually could be another object like a moon, and you use the gravity of that object to sort of sling you around and change course or sometimes speed you up. Very useful if it's done correctly to take you onto the trajectory
we do this all the time,
we do. Yeah. And this guy, Giuseppe Colombo, Bepi Colombo, was the first person to suggest it. So I think it's a really nice touch. It's named after him. It's currently due to reach orbit of Mercury November next year, November 26th.
Yeah, because it was supposed to be December this year.
It was, and there was something there was something
like
that, which meant they had to do a little tweak to the trajectory, and it just meant they changed the orbit, changed the trajectory, I should say very slightly. What about the two sections? So we have the European section is called the Mercury. I'm reading these. The Mercury Planetary Orbiter, the MPO. The Japanese section, we in Europe are calling it the Mercury Magnetospheric Orbiter, MMO, which I think is a chance missed because the Japanese have given it a lovely name. It's called MIO.
Oh, that is nice.
That is the Japanese word for some kind of waterway, and they're talking about that as representative of historical exploration, sailing across the seas. And also Mercury in Japanese is known as the water star or the water planet, so it ties in really nicely. I think it's a chance missed. Given the acronym MMO, couldn't we have found something to make it MIO and at least tie in with that Japanese word?
I'm sure, they're clever enough to work out the gravity assist of getting. I'm sure they could have worked out MIO.
Anyway, so that's a very brief run through of Bepi Colombo. Should be a fascinating mission. It's going to give us a whole load of information about Mercury, maybe things about how it was formed. Ed, you're going to talk about one next. Again, different part of the world. And I very specifically, on your instructions, have not looked up anything about this. I know nothing about this topic. Take it away.
Yeah, well, I'm sticking to Asia a little bit. So keeping up with Japan, we're now moving over to China. China is very much becoming a big superpower when it comes to kind of space exploration. And they have been setting their sights recently on the moon. And they're actually one of the only countries that is really actually doing a lot of stuff with the moon. When it comes to specific kind of space agencies, less so with private companies, some are still doing that. But China have actually been landing things on the moon as part of their Chang'e missions. And we have Chang'e 5, which landed on the moon back in 2020. And this was a sample return mission. So we're picking up rocks, bringing them back to planet Earth. And this is really good because, yes, you can study things in situ, but all of the stuff, all the scientific equipment has to be taken with the kind of space probe to
So
actually do the study.
bringing stuff back, we can do a lot more rigorous, a lot more detailed analysis.
Exactly, and you can actually get human eyes on it as well, which, you can improve the amount of science that you can actually do. So they brought back about 1.7 kilograms worth of material back to Earth, and they've been studying it for a very long time. So Chinese scientists have been studying it. It's really, really good, these samples, because they're only about 2 billion years old.
Okay.
And I say only 2 billion years.
Yeah.
But obviously, as you well know, I mean, the moon is over 4 billion years old. And a lot of the samples that we have already brought back, so
from the Apollo missions.
Apollo missions, they brought back loads, like 400 kilograms or something like that.
I think it was even more than that, but
probably
yeah,
even more than
hundreds
that.
of kilograms.
But also, the Soviet Union brought back some samples. Those are all about 3 or 4 billion years old.
Interesting.
So this is some samples that are only 2 billion years old. So after the moon had definitely pretty much fully formed into sort of what it looks like today, we're getting some samples back that actually represent that portion of
Did you say we
history.
already have these samples back?
Yeah, so they arrived in 2020, and as I said, Chinese scientists have been working on it, but this is about international collaboration, right?
Where's the collaboration?
The collaboration is China have actually opened up the ability for international kind of scientists, institutes, to get their hands on some of these samples.
That's very interesting, because a little bit like we were talking about earlier about the Russian, the Soviet American mission, I talked about Apollo-Soyuz. Quite encouraging that in a scientific way they're working together.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about this, that China are being open. We wouldn't necessarily expect that from here in the West.
Definitely not. It's sort of the thing you wouldn't think about that at all. And in fact, especially if you're looking at it from a Western point of view, NASA and China are not allowed to work together. So they're not allowed to collaborate on things.
Whose rule is that?
But
from both sides?
All NASA. Pretty much. It's a lot of stuff to do with kind of they don't want to share their technology and all this stuff. It's a political thing and a geopolitical thing and all this kind of stuff. But this is about scientists and scientists working together. So
lovely.
So US scientists have got some of these samples because they're not working for NASA. They're working for their particular institutes. There's also Germany, there's France, Japan, Pakistan, and more importantly, the UK.
Lovely.
For us. Now, I say Chang'e 5 brought back about 1.7 kilograms. We have got a grand total of 60 milligrams.
60 milligrams, wow.
Which is not very much as it sounds. But I mean, it's still, you can get a lot of science from that. We've got microscopes that can blow that up so it looks really, really big. And we'll get lots of interesting things. And also, there is the follow-up mission, Chang'e 6, that has already brought back stuff. That came back last year, 2024. So hopefully, in probably about 2 years, if we're talking about the same time frame, we'll also have those samples that are opened up to international.
Okay, that's a very encouraging story. And I think probably the moral of that is, let's put scientists in charge of the world.
I mean, it makes sense to me.
It would make my updates about Donald Trump a little bit less frequent.
A little bit easy.
Let me move on to my final one.
This
is one, again, we talked about the ISS. This is one that I'm sure lots of our listeners and viewers will know an awful lot about, but you may not realise the extent of international collaboration. This is the James Webb Space Telescope. So it's a space telescope. It's pretty much the most powerful one we've ever built. It's out there about 1.5 million kilometres from the Earth, orbiting a point in space, the Lagrange point 2, second Lagrange point.
Yes, we talked about that a couple of podcasts.
Yeah, I think you and Dara mentioned it, didn't you?
Kind of where gravity sort of balances out.
It balances in the Sun-Earth system. I think you explained it better than I did in your podcast last time. Now, to get it there, it was launched on an ESA spacecraft, the Ariane 5.
Yeah.
It's a NASA-led project. So NASA built the main bulk of the telescope, the mirror, the heat shield, which is vital to keep the instruments safe from the heat from the sun. But it was launched on an ESA spacecraft. And the instruments on board are a real mix. There are 4 or 5, depending on how you classify them, instruments on board. One was built by the University of Arizona. One is an ESA creation.
Sorry, just to go back to that. So not from like a space agency, so it's a university.
I believe they were working with NASA in doing it, but
so
it was
getting like NASA funding.
The scientists involved were based at the University of Arizona. The second instrument is an ESA one, designed and built in the Netherlands. Then we have one which was a collaboration between NASA and Europe, led by the UK. This is the mid-infrared instrument, MIRI. And finally, 1 or maybe 2 instruments built in Canada. It's one single object, but it has two basically separate instruments in it. One of those, interestingly, is called the Fine Guidance Sensor, and that has a really important role in calibrating things and keeping everything lined up correctly, which is vital for this space telescope, to keep the mirror lined up correctly and also to keep the orientation of the spacecraft, because those heat shields, as I mentioned earlier, are vital to protect the instruments from the heat of the sun. That can cause disturbances in the infrared signal, for example, which is the light that James Webb generally looks at.
Infrared is a special, essentially heat vision, right?
Exactly.
So, if you've
so
got a load of
any
heat from the sun,
that's going to destroy that. So really, really important collaboration between different agencies and different, as you said, academic institutions collaborating to do this. I've got some numbers here. Total of 258 organisations, that's companies, government agencies, universities, things like that, all involved in the design and build. It's a phenomenal, like we said about the ISS, a phenomenal project we could probably talk about forever. But important that I don't do that here.
Well, I was going to say, just to kind of finish off, James Webb cost, what, $10 billion, something like that?
Something like that. I don't know the exact number.
If we want those kind of space telescopes that are absolutely amazing, or general missions, it's quite good to be able to get lots of agencies together to share the funding of that as well.
Absolutely. And part of the payoff of that is that we in ESA and the Canadians as well get to have some of the telescope time. Basically, they get to control some of the things it's looking at as part of the payoff of contributing so much to the project.
So very good for kind of university.
It's very good for science
in the UK.
Here. Okay, that's the end of mine. I think both of my last two, quite common these days to have space probes where you have instruments of different agencies, different countries working together. Yours, I think we're going back to human spaceflight.
Going back a little bit, quite a long time now. This is Intercosmos, the Intercosmos program, which was a Soviet program. So we're talking about 1970. I think it was 1978 to 1991.
Which was the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think.
About the breakup of the Soviet Union. Well, interesting, we'll get to that a little bit later on, don't worry. So this Intercosmos program, between those two dates, was all about launching humans into space. But not just any humans, it's launching humans from countries that couldn't launch their own citizens to space.
Because very few can.
I mean, still, there's only, the USA, Russia and China. They're the only
India,
ones.
Hoping to become the fourth soon. There's been some delays in that project.
Shortly, and I mean, ESA have got plans. They've had plans for a long time, but reliably, I mean, there's only three rockets that can actually reliably get people into space that are proven to be able to do that. But the Soviets basically said to kind of all these friendly countries that they were friendly with, anyone want to go to space, essentially.
So is this is during the Soviet era, so is this only communist countries that they were working with?
So it's not just communist countries, although it is quite often communist countries. It's more kind of friendly countries, so maybe trade partners as well. I actually have a list.
Okay, I was hoping you might,
Like you've been reading off, I definitely have to read off
some of these things you need to.
So there's 18 astronauts in total. I'm just going to rattle them off. We've got Czechoslovakia, Poland, the German Democratic Republic, Bulgaria, Hungary, Vietnam, Cuba, Mongolia, Romania, France, India, Syria, Afghanistan, Japan, the United Kingdom, and Austria.
So actually quite a few there, because the first half of that list was all communist countries.
So I think that's very much what it was originally made to be,
and then they extended it.
And then, it extended out, and it wasn't just sort of countries within sort of this Soviet control. So, for example, we've got German Democratic Republic, East Germany. So even though it's not sort of technically under the Soviet Union, it is part of the Soviet Union.
It was
at the
in
same
the
time.
Eastern Bloc, all those first ones,
but then you also end up with Vietnam and Cuba, so communist countries, but
less directly
pretty far
control.
away. And then right at the end, as I said, United Kingdom.
I was going to ask you, so I think I know who this was, but tell me the background, tell me anything.
So this was basically called Project Juno, and it was the project to send the first British person into space. And that person was Helen Sharman. So back in 1991, she managed to go to space. She flew to Space Station Mir, which we talked a little bit about. That was in 1991, and she spent 8 days there. And what's really interesting is before that, she wasn't kind of technically a astronaut. She just sort of heard a radio announcement and she applied.
I remember hearing that.
Absolutely. She worked for Mars, the confectionery company. She was a chemist there.
Name.
But when I say that she wasn't an astronaut technically before that, it wasn't like she applied, got the job, and then the next day went to space. She still had to do about 18 months worth of training. So she was definitely an astronaut by the end of it, and she actually went forward for some of the European Space Agency's astronaut
that's
corps.
interesting.
At least applied for this. She was unfortunately not successful with that. But yeah, she went up into space. But one main thing that I want to say about this collaboration when it comes to the UK is the fact that originally this mission was supposed to cost about £7 million. That would be the cost of a seat, essentially. And the idea for Britain is the government weren't going to pay for this. So this is going to be paid for by companies, a consortium of companies. So there's things like ITV got the television rights. So they paid for part of that ticket based on that. So she found out live on ITV that she was going to space, essentially.
That's incredible.
Which is quite funny. But they didn't raise enough money. So it was going to be cancelled. So this would have been the end of kind of British hopefulness in space and sending up a British astronaut.
So what happened? Was it just a bit of altruism, generosity from the Soviets?
It's exactly what it was.
That's fantastic.
So Gorbachev, kind of the leader of the Soviet Union at that point, basically instructed that they would kind of make up the difference and get Helen Sharman into space.
I wonder why that was. I wonder if they viewed that as a useful PR thing to include Western countries.
I think it's useful PR, useful kind of, obviously they want relations with more Western countries, especially kind of in the 1990s.
Yeah.
They want a lot better relationship with Western countries. And so, yeah, they paid for the mission. So not only was it a collaboration of the actual launch vehicle, the Soviets actually helped pay for Helen Sharman's seat as well. So not just that. So, yeah.
Once again, finishing off with some encouraging ideas in the space sector and in science more generally of people collaborating in a way that politicians can't always manage. Exactly.
And I mean, that sort of collaboration, this Intercosmos program, has led to plenty more things. So we had the Shuttle Mir program, so Russian astronauts flying on the space shuttle,
which did use some of the docking technology I talked about.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, the docking technology that you talked about that then also led to the docking technology on the International Space Station.
It all ties in.
And led to the International Space Station itself. But I said not just 1991, it went a little bit further than that until 1994. It wasn't just human spaceflight. What Intercosmos was is it also launched 31 uncrewed missions as well.
I didn't know that.
So kind of scientific equipment and missions and instruments and kind of designs from all around the world, all of these different countries were launched using Soviet rockets into space to do a variety of different things. Yeah. And that went all the way to 1994, so after the Soviet Union was dissolved.
Well, there you go. I definitely didn't know about that.
So pretty exciting stuff. I mean, yeah, as we said. I mean, there's loads more that we could talk about, and we could have gone way more into depth. One thing that we didn't mention, of course, was the European Space Agency as a whole.
Mentioned, but only in passing.
But yeah, I mean, that's, 23 member states, I want to say.
That sounds about right.
Now all kind of contributing. The UK's part of that, and then kind of being involved with missions such as the James Webb Space Telescope, the International Space Station as well. But lots of collaboration in space, which is really good. If you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, well then I have got good news for you, because I've actually written a blog about lots of more international collaborations in space. A little bit about what we've talked about today, but a little bit few more hidden insights as well. You can check that out on our website. It's going up in a few weeks. David, you also write blogs as well. Have you been
occasionally,
writing recently?
Not as many as you. The last couple I've done, I've got one coming up, which for the flag geeks amongst you, I'm definitely one of those. It's looking at stars and constellations that appear on flags. I wrote one in February, which kind of ties in with the theme of kind of international stuff, space across the world. That was looking at the origins of planet names, not just in English, but in different cultures as well. Nice. But there's all kinds of blogs on all aspects of space on our Space Now blog online, written by all kinds of our colleagues across the Space Centre. So if you are interested in that, check those out as well, including a summer stargazing blog, which you may well be able to have a look at and find some things to look at in the sky this summer.
Absolutely, and you might recognise some things in the sky on those flags that you just mentioned.
You may well do.
But of course, you can come and join us at the National Space Centre this summer, where we're celebrating space across the world. You can join us for all of our amazing activities, talks, planetarium shows. We're taking a look at the cultural impact of the moon throughout history, space agencies from all over the world, and constellations as well, and the kind of stories linked to them. And also, what we do have in our galleries, we do have the chair that helped launch Helen Sharman to space. You can come and check that out if you've enjoyed this talk about international collaborations as well.
Now that brings us to the end of this episode of Space Now. Thank you very much, Ed.
And thank you, David.
And thank you to all you at home for listening or watching. We'll be back next Friday to go once again beyond the headlines of space news. So subscribe, like this episode, share it with a friend, And if you're watching on YouTube, why not click the bell to make sure you'll be notified whenever a new episode drops.
Absolutely. And remember, we want to know what you want to know. So make sure that you get in touch with us at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk or contact us on social media with all of your questions and requests. We've already answered a few of them. You have been answering them over on our mailbag
couple of
episodes.
mailbag episodes, yes.
Fantastic. This has been very, very interesting. I've enjoyed them, certainly.
Bit nerve-wracking.
Absolutely. But thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you all again soon.